Thank you so much, Lisa. My name is Andrea Guiden, and I am an Educator Diversity Lead at the Center on Great Teachers and Leaders with AIR. I'm also a historian of education, and my scholarship highlights the history of education in America, specifically the history of teachers, the history of teachers' work, and the history of education policies that have governed teachers' work across several years. And I thought it might be interesting to take a step back and maybe look at a few historical events that have played a role in where we are today with the composition of the educator workforce. So very good. Thank you, Christina. So here I created a timeline that basically gives us a snapshot of particular moments in history and the history of teachers and teaching. Now, I want to make it clear, first of all, that history is not clean like this. It doesn't come in clean linear lines and things don't happen like step one, step two. It can be a bit messy. But my goal for today is to just give you a few snapshots that give a context for what we're going to discuss today. So let's start first with 1837, which was the development of common schools. The common schools would be comparable to what we hear as, or what we call public schools in the present day. However, these schools were designed primarily to serve white children. And the teachers in these schools were white, but most notably, they were male. And teaching was seasonal work. It wasn't something that was year-round, full-time. It was a part-time gig, essentially, for these white males before they went off to law school or to other university studies, or even to become ministers in some cases. And over time, as the population of the United States became greater and we had immigrants coming from other countries, there was a disgruntled nature of conversation as it related to these new immigrants in the country coming from different countries. The complaint was that they don't know how to behave. They're too wild, they're too boisterous. We need to do something to Americanize them or to teach them the American way, how we behave here, what we believe here. And so the best way they decided to do this would be the schools, right? We start with children, and if we can educate children, the children learn the way things should be done, and they can then take that information home to their families. And who best to do this, to teach these children these morals, social mores, the American way, than women. Women are the first teachers. They have the children in the home, they're nurturing, they know what it's like to work with children. So women are the ones who would be best suited to be in schools, not men per se. Women are used to operating in the home sphere, but we'll put them in the public sphere and even give them a little money. So we can pay them less than we're paying the male teachers. So what happens during this period, 1850 and afterwards, the teaching field becomes feminized. So we have primarily women, and these are white women who are going to be the conduits of education, academically, socially, emotionally, for the children in America. A few years later, at the end of the Civil War, education then becomes legally accessible to all. So the formerly enslaved, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, everyone has this ability to be educated legally and lawfully at this time. But the schools, however, are still segregated. Schools are segregated by race. So none of the races are going to school together, but everyone is being educated within individuals that match their race or match their ethnicity. All the while, worthy of note is that the teachers in these schools, the segregated schools, also tend to be white and female, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Moving on to the mid-19th century, we have normal schools for teachers. And these schools exposed these women to a teacher training experience that wasn't offered in schools of higher education. They didn't necessarily have an education component. So the normal schools were what we used in order to train the teachers. Now, at this time, teaching begins to take shape in a different way than it did before, when we just thought of women as nurturers in the schools. So now we have formal coursework, we have the development of standards, we have teacher credentialing. In essence, teaching is becoming professionalized. And these women teachers want to be seen as professionals. They want to be treated as professionals. And it's also during this period that we see the beginning of collective bargaining units, so teachers' unions. They want someone to be able to speak for them so they can have agency, they can have autonomy in the work. Worthy of note here is that as these teachers are having normal schools and being credentials, these too are segregated by race. So we have normal schools predominantly for white teachers, for Black teachers. for Latinx teachers. And everybody's on their own path to professional status, their own path to credentialing, but those paths do not look the same. And I want to conclude this slide talking about women's suffrage in 1920, because it was especially during this period that white women teachers had this growing sense of power and belonging in the public sphere. They have a job, they have a paycheck, and they're the ones who are predominantly populating the schools. But we have teachers of other races who are battling a few isms in American society. So they're dealing with sexism, they're dealing with racism, and they're also dealing with the idea that they too want to be seen as professionals, but they have the added struggle of also wanting to be seen as individuals within the American society as a whole. Christina, if you could go to the next slide. And so here we have segregated public schooling for students. It was the order of the day. So while materials were often scarce in these segregated school systems, communities of color as a whole were really grateful to have the opportunity to legally create these learning environments. After all, multiple philanthropists, abolitionists, activists had fought long and hard for this right. And so we're able to have schools, but they're segregated, and still the teachers in many of these schools are largely white and female. The court cases that I've listed here deal with issues of segregated schooling and the idea of using legislation and using policy in order to build equality into the American school system. And this is primarily through the means of desegregation. So these cases cover the desire for Asian Americans, particularly Japanese, Mexican Americans, and Black Americans to desegregate the schools and get more equality as it related to the education that students were able to receive. Again, as I mentioned before, the teachers were largely white and female, and there were particular reasons for that. And these are a few barriers. This is just three, but there were multiple reasons why these teachers were not able to work in public school systems at the time. So first of all, Black, Indigenous, and people of color had limited access to institutions of higher education. Many of them did not meet the ever-increasing criteria for teaching schools. And I want to note that there's a really rich body of historical literature that goes into historically Black colleges and universities and the development of those, so that we can have more teacher candidates of color receive the education that they need to become teachers. But once upon a time, they didn't have the access to higher education that perhaps other races may have had. Also, most school districts during the segregated period of education, particularly in the South, were run by individuals who held that teachers of color were inferior to white teachers simply by nature of race, not necessarily because of any grades in their normal school or any performance measures, but solely by race. And then finally, following the Brown ruling, there were lots of teachers of color who had the good fortune to maintain their jobs or to be hired for another teaching position, but they experienced severe workplace hostility that was based on race, and this impacted their professional, their economic, social, and emotional well-being. Okay, Christina. So in this slide, I talk about a few concerted efforts to maintain a white educator workforce. So for example, both before and following school desegregation in the 1950s and 60s, belonging to the NAACP was grounds for dismissal for many school systems, because they perceived not only the NAACP to be an organization that was anti-American, but they also saw this organization's advocacy for Black teachers to receive equal pay to white teachers as something that was threatening to the livelihood of white teachers in America. Secondly, we see changes to teacher tenure laws following Brown v. Board of Education. So as soon as Brown v. Board, the ruling came down, immediately teacher tenure laws in several states are altered to require additional years of service in order to gain tenure, and then additional requirements in order to gain tenure. And that was a concerted way of making sure that the workforce maintained the composition that it had and did not have a huge rush of teachers of color. And there is historical literature to support that. And then The push for teacher competency and certification examinations intensified, and test makers began including questions that reflected cultural bias intentionally in hopes of weeding out what they could call incompetent teachers. And then finally, over time, school systems began increasing the minimum passing scores on these exams in order to weed out, again, those teachers that we perceive to be incompetent. And this particular practice was maintained well into the 1970s. So it hasn't been very long that this was an issue. So all in all, at the end of the day, following Brown, approximately 38,000 Black teachers lost their jobs due to these concerted efforts to maintain a white educated workforce. So what I want to do here in this final slide is link the past and the present as it relates to education policy. So first of all, let's look at then. And by then in this particular slide, I mean pre-Brown, so pre-1954. So then de jure segregation was the order of the day. And by de jure segregation, we mean the official law of the land at that time. So this was legal. Schools were legally segregated. But now, and I'm sure many of you on here have read the literature and read the articles, schools are presently desegregated. But it's not as a result of de jure, it's not legal to do that, but it's what we call de facto segregation. It's not legal, but it's happening somehow, some way. And one of the reasons for this, we have embedded policies, whether educationally or federally, that allow school zoning to create situations where people who happen to be of the same color and live in the same area are going to the same schools. And that's just one example. A second example of then and now is significant reliance on competency examination scores. Now, before I go into this, I want to say that we at the GTL Center absolutely support standards for teachers and having fair mechanisms for ways to fill classrooms with effective teachers. But the intention in this case was a heavy reliance on this so that we could weed out, like I said earlier, incompetent teachers and make sure that there were not too many teachers of color who could enter the workforce. We're shifting that in the present day. While there still is some reliance upon competency examination scores, we also have an expansion of opportunities for licensure, multiple pathways for becoming a teacher, multiple programs that we have so that we can attract teachers of color to the education workforce. And then finally, I'll end with racialized screening of candidates once upon a time was absolutely a legal thing to do. And I won't go as far as to say that it's not happening today, but what I think we are doing is recognizing that it exists, that race-based analysis exists, and it impacts who's being allowed to come into the classroom, who has access to the classroom. And I think it's important that we have events like this and that we have books like Dr. Lindsay's book that help us to realize it, recognize it, acknowledge it, and then do something about it. And that's part of our goal with today's event.